So this is the third technique shot, which I'm going to do just talk about a little bit. Now, this one is probably a little bit more VFX-y than the other ones, but this is just to show you the power of the Blender particle system. Now, I'm not going to use the original file for this one because I want to preface this with the fact that it does get very, very slow, but I will explain to you the technique that I use to create the effect that you see here. So we'll start from scratch with the particle system and just very basically look at how you'd approach something like this. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to close this and I'm going to start very simply by adding a cube. Now, actually I'm not going to add a cube. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a plane. So I'm going to do this with a lot less particles than you see in the video to keep it a little bit quicker, but the technique is exactly the same, and we can go from there and you can see exactly what I did. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to scale this plane up a little bit so it's a little bit bigger. I'm going to add a new particle system to this. Now I'm just going to have everything emit from frame 1 just so we have some very, very basic particles. Now what I like doing is setting the normal emitter quite low and then turning off the gravity in the world as well. There's two ways of doing this. If you want to have multiple particle systems, one with gravity and one without, then I would recommend not turning this off and just going down to the field weights down here and just turning off gravity, which will have the same effect. So what that means is our particles will just keep following a path, and they'll just keep doing that until they either disappear or it's the end of your scene, the end of your timeline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have these with a lifetime of 999, so they won't disappear towards the end of the scene. They'll stay there, and I'm just going to have a very, very small number of them moving across. Let's say 5, maybe 10. There we go. And this first particle system is actually going to be the base for a second one that we're going to create, and we're going to use this one to emit from and emit a whole bunch of extra particles to generate this really cool particle stream. Now I'm going to keep this simple. I'm going to set the field weights down here, all the field weights to 0, so these are just going to move in a straight fashion, so you can see exactly what I'm going to do with these field weights when I add in the second particle system. So how do you get particles to emit from particles? Now, I've already said it, we're going to add a second system, but what we need to do first is add in a mesh, a cube mesh. I'm going to scale this down so it's quite small. And what we can do with it, if I'm just going to move it over on the x-axis so you can see exactly what's going on. If we add in a particle instance modifier and we grab the plane object that has the particles, you'll see what it does. It's going to use the object that we've created and put it in place of every particle of the particle system that we're selecting here. You can see you can select between different ones. I'm just going to have all the ones that are alive. For us, it's not going to make a difference. If I were to change this, for example, and I would have them emit between 1 and 24, or let's say 1 and 72 rather. There we go. Now we'll have some of them show up as they're emitting. Actually, we can leave it like that. It doesn't look too bad. But the most important thing to note is that if this unborn and dead is on, you get these really weird results because it's already showing the particles that haven't been spawned yet. So I'm going to turn these off, and there we go. Very simple. Now we have our master particle. So if you looked at the shot before, you have these sort of red flickering particles, and they're actually these particles in this particle instance that are being used as an emitter, and I just put an emission shader on them. And now we can actually start emitting particles from these ones. So I'm going to add a second particle system to this, and it tends to wig out a little bit. But if you hit use modifier stack, it's going to take into account the particles that are already in there. I'm just going to turn off the normal speed. Now, because we turned off gravity globally, or in the, where is it? I keep missing it. There we go. So we turned off gravity globally. You know, they were staying in place. So generally, when I'm doing these really intricate, weird looking effects, I turn off gravity altogether because now when these are being emitted, they're just staying in one place. So you can already see we have these sort of interesting looking trails happening. Now, you want to make sure that the second particle system is emitting for the entire length of your timeline. So I'm going to set this from 1 to 120, and I'm going to leave the lifetime up to 999, so they stay in the image from start to finish. So now when they're emitting, you can see they just stay where they are. So if you want this to line up with your original particle system, all you need to do is your cube object. So remember this small object that we're using the particle instance modifier under. So I'm going to call this particle base and call this one particle.trails. If you want it to line up, then you have to line up the pivot point with the original particle systems object. So I know this one's in the middle, so I just hit Alt-G to reset it to 0, 0, 0, and now you'll see it actually lines up perfectly with the original particle system. Now for this, for these purposes, I'm going to offset it a little bit and just show you exactly what's going on. So what do we need to do now? We're actually halfway there. We already have particles emitting particles, so the hard part is kind of over. Now we can get to the creative part. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. If I up the emission here to 5,000, then it's all right. It's not too slow yet, but we still need a second object to fill in the particles here. Now, you might be tempted to just grab the same one, but because it has a particle instance modifier on it, you're going to get really, really weird results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a second cube. There we go. I'm going to call that particle trails shape. There we go. And grab this one, and at the bottom here, I'm going to set it to object and particle trails shape. And now, as you can see, we have these really tiny particles. I believe in the final thing I used cubes as well. You might be tempted to use spheres to make it look a little bit better, but think about this. For the final simulation of this, I believe I used 3 million particles. So if you're going to open that file, you might have to rebake it, but make sure you have everything set up, like your cache set up properly. I might talk about that actually in the next video. So we'll leave that for now, but I'll explain in the next video why this caching stuff is really important when you're working with a lot of particles. So right now we have these cubes, and they're just doing their thing. Actually, I'm going to grab this cube and I'll make it a little bit smaller. Maybe not that small. So 0.1, something like that. There we go. And we have a nice tiny emitter, and we have these really tiny trails. So this will also determine how big your trail is and how far apart these particles are. And now we have something that looks pretty similar to what we had before. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add just a tiny bit of geometry. And as you can see, this is splitting up into it looks to be like about 4 or 5 different trails, and this is because we have particles moving from the cube itself. So if I were to scale this back up again to show you, we have particles emitting from each side, which means we get these 4 sort of separate trails because we have these polygons here. Now if you wanted to get really perfectionist with it, you could grab the top and bottom faces, delete them out, and we're going to have to rotate our object itself. Or actually, I'm just going to rotate this. There we go. And now we don't have any particles emitting from the top and bottom, which means you'll just have those 4 streams. So if I scale this back down just a touch again, you'll see you'll get this really interesting looking result. And I used the same technique on the final version of this as well. So now you get these multiple streams coming off one particle, and they're all dependent on the shape of your particle. So you can mess with that as well. So now for the next part, we want this really cool swirly motion. And this is why I like Blender's particle system. You can test stuff out with fewer particles, and I'm just going to add in a force field here, and I'm going to add in a turbulence. So what you're going to see immediately is that they're being affected by this turbulence in a major way. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the Dynamics tab here and actually bring down the strength quite a bit, and maybe bring down the size. Experiment with the size. Sometimes bigger and smaller can give you really interesting results. So there we go. Maybe bring down the strength just another little bit. And I like doing this as interactively as possible. So now we're getting sort of interesting looking results, but I want a little bit more variation. So I'm going to call this one force turbulence big. Now when I duplicate that, I'm going to call this one small. And remember, our original particle system isn't being affected by this turbulence because we have the field weights turned all the way down. So if I were to turn this one up, you'll see that the original particle systems themselves are also moving just a little bit. If you look over here, I hope it's clear enough in the recording. You can see they're moving over just a little bit as well. So now we get turbulence on both particle systems. Now for this smaller turbulence, I'm going to do exactly what the name suggests. I'm just going to turn this down a little bit. And what this does, it creates multiple layers of turbulence. And as you can see, this creates a way more interesting effect. So this is a little trick that I picked up when I was doing visual effects. Is I think even in the final render, I end up using 3 layers of turbulence. Is if you stack at least 2 layers of turbulence on top of each other, you get way more natural looking turbulence. You get a lot more detail in it, and it looks a lot more interesting. Now, to get this to look even better, what we're going to have to do now is crank up the amount of particles. So I'm going to crank them up tenfold, set the number to 50,000. And let's see, I'm not going to bake it to my disk. I'm just going to bake it in memory for now. And this is still fairly quick. Remember, we're only at 50,000. I used 3 million for the final result. But if we play this now, you'll see that you get these really nice looking thick particle streams that are breaking apart as the turbulence takes hold of them. So that's the basic technique behind the shot. And we'll open up the file in a second video and just have a look at the final settings that I used and the slight differences between this one and the final one. So see you in the next video.